So yeah, this is my talk. These still aren't the SCs you're looking for. Misadventures in WCAG 2.x interpretation and audits. So about me, really briefly, I'm a principal accessibility inside the box. So you can see me on camera. Right. I'm a principal accessibility specialist at Tetralogical. Previously I worked for the Paciello Group, now TPGI. I'm an occasional member of the Accessibility Guidelines Working Group, and I'm, as mentioned, a WCAG Trash Panda. Now, some of you may have a sense of déjà vu. You may have already seen an early version of this particular talk. Yes, I'm now, we're a few years later. I'm now older and a little bit more round and a bit grayer, but unfortunately I still see the same questions bubble up constantly on mailing lists, on Slack, and everything else. And the question generally relates to which success criterion can I fail this particular thing under? And I've got a meme picture here, fail all the things. That is often the attitude that I find when people do audits and ask advice, how can I fail this particular thing? And far too often, what we have is basically auditors that clearly dislike something, and they're looking for a justification to basically ding the client and say, no, you shouldn't do this. And I get it. I've been there as well in my early years, and it's also quite exciting sometimes when you come up with some really interesting interpretation of a success criterion, just so you can say, yeah, well, if you look at it a certain way, it might actually fail this criterion. But what we often do as auditors when that happens is we kind of overstep the boundaries of what the WCAG success criteria themselves actually mean. And we claim that something has to be fixed or changed to pass WCAG when it normatively actually doesn't. It's only something that we maybe personally don't like. And if we do that, we end up like Stallone in the fantastic Judge Dredd movie saying, I am the law. But we are not lawyers, thankfully, or judges. But our audits often have a certain, sometimes have a certain angle relating to legal dimensions, really. Evaluations should therefore be objective as possible. And evaluations should also be consistent. And of course, that's easier said than done. Now, WCAG is built on the idea that the success criteria can be evaluated clearly and unambiguously and consistently for the most part. So you get multiple auditors working in different companies. They will all roughly come to the same conclusion. But unfortunately, that's not always the case. And now, with WCAG 2.2, we have 9 more success criteria to play with. And in my view, to an extent, that just increases the potential for more inconsistencies, confusions, and misinterpretations. So I'm only going to pick a few examples in my talk. I've already got far too many slides, so there's a betting pool going around how long I will be overrunning. Not if, but how long. So my money's on 10 minutes, but we'll see. But there's more where that came from. So at some point, I might even skip some slides, depending on how angry the staff are looking at me from over there. So WCAG success criteria are often misunderstood and or misinterpreted. And that can lead to inconsistencies in audits and in the way that we report errors in assessments. And I've got an animated GIF here of Obi-Wan waving his hand. These aren't the droids you're looking for. That's kind of the conceit for, at least for the title of my talk. These aren't the SCs you're looking for. So I'm going to go through a few. One of my favorites, 246, headings and labels. Headings and labels describe topic or purpose. Now, this success criterion itself doesn't actually mandate that we should have headings or labels in our pages. It only says that if you have them, then they should be descriptive and relate to the topic at hand, really. it doesn't mandate that. 131 info and relationships is probably the more appropriate one. And when it comes to things like form controls, obviously, if you haven't got a label, that can have an impact on 412 name, role, and value. And lastly, if the labels aren't there at all, that would probably be a failure of 332 labels or instructions. So it's just about being clear where these particular SCs actually lie and what they actually say. So as a really basic example, I've got a little bit of code here. I've got a paragraph element. I've just given it a class of heading 1, more information. This would pass 246 headings and labels. Imagine that it's styled to look like a heading. Great. You know, this passes. It works visually as a label. And assuming that the content that comes after it is more information, it is descriptive of the topic. It will fail, likely, 131 info and relationships, because it's probably styled like a heading, but it's not marked up as a heading. Now, 332 labels or instructions. We mentioned them a second ago. Labels or instructions are provided when content requires user input. Now, again, this doesn't actually mandate that the labels need to be marked up as like a label element, or you must make sure that it's label 4 and it's pointing to the ID of the element or anything like that. That's not what this criterion actually says. That's covered, again, by 131, info and relationships. And again, if you end up with, say, an input that all of a sudden doesn't have an accessible name because of a lack of association, that would then be a 412 name, role, and value problem. Again, a little bit of markup. I've just got an input type text with nothing else around it. This would pass 246, because remember, headings and labels doesn't say you have to have these things, just that if they are there, they need to be descriptive. Yes, it will fail labels or instructions, 332, and in this case, it will fail 412 name, role, value. Now, if I just add a paragraph in front of that, that says first name, so visually I see that first name and then there's a text input. Again, that passes 246 headings and labels. I've got a label there that says first name. Yes, it's not marked up correctly, but it serves the purpose of defining what that input is and what's expected. It passes 332 labels or instructions because, again, yes, I have an input there, and I have instructions there and a label there that basically says what's expected. But then, yes, it will fail 131 info and relationships. It fails 253 label in name, because visually there is first name, but the accessible name is effectively empty on that one. And it will fail 412 name, role, value, because that input lacks an accessible name to begin with. Now, we can make it super exciting and just stick an ARIA label of first name that basically replicates that paragraph before it. And all of a sudden, everything passes. So as before, 246 headings and labels, 332 labels or instructions. Now, 253 label in name. Yes, visually it says first name, and the ARIA label says first name. That passes label in name. It also passes 412 because obviously that input does have a name now, so name, role, value is satisfied. And arguably, you could even say that it passes, or at least it doesn't fail, 131 info and relationships. Yes, I didn't give the formal label element, label 4, pointing to the ID of the input or anything else, but for all intents and purposes, it provides the same information, that ARIA label. So even though it's not linked with that, yes, you can make an argument, but then I can't click with the mouse on first name and it sets focus. But that, again, that's not what the SC or the SCs actually demand. So this would be perfectly fine. You know, I wouldn't code that like that myself, but this would pass. And many auditors will find one of these to fail this particular construct under. 211. Keyboard. All functionality of the content is operable through a keyboard interface. Now, it doesn't say anything about which keys on the keyboard you should actually use. I've got an example here, some code. I've got the classic. It's a link with an on-click roll button, so I'm actually being really good to say what it is, and fake button. Now, to activate this, normally with a button, you'd activate it with space. But in this case, because I've not added any extra JavaScript to handle that, I can only activate it using the Enter key. And under 211, that is perfectly fine. Again, some auditors will find an excuse to say, yeah, it's because it doesn't behave the right way. If it really is a button, it should be space. But that, again, that's not what the SC itself actually says. So we'd have to pass it under 211. We'd probably tell the client, you know, if you're doing this, you should really make sure that I can also activate it with a space bar. But, you know, formally, normatively, this passes. Now, a really contrived example. Again, I've got a link, a roll button, activate using B, and I've written myself some JavaScript there. That actually listens for the B key and then activates it. I don't know why you would ever want to do that, but normatively, if you just look at the language of 211, there is a way for a keyboard user to effectively trigger this particular control. So again, I'd have to, if I want to stick to what WCAG says, the letter of WCAG, I'd have to pass that. 133, sensory characteristics. Instructions provided for understanding and operating content do not rely solely on sensory characteristics of components, such as shape, color, size, visual location, orientation, or sound. Now, this SC is also often misinterpreted. It actually only relates to instructions themselves, not whether the thing, say the button or whatever, is using color, shape, location, etc., as an identifier. But if there are instructions anywhere else on the page that then relate to these controls and only use those qualifiers to, you know, give instructions, to give help to the user, that is the failure. So I've got two examples here. So in the top row, I've got two buttons. One is kind of a rounded square, one is a circle. In the second row, I've got two buttons that are both square. One is red, one is green. Now, in isolation, if a web page did this, yes, I would likely fail this under 111 non-text content if there is no hidden text there that gives the controls an accessible name. I might fail this under 141 use of color for the second set, because we're kind of distinguishing things purely by color, apparently anyway. I mean, these are all isolated examples, so there might be other stuff in the page that mitigates this, but, you know, just looking at them cold like that, that would probably be a likelihood. I might fail them under 412, name role value, if there is no accessible name, if they haven't been given something like an ARIA label or something like that. But, more importantly, under 133 sensory characteristics, which is the SC that I'm ranting about, one of many, this would be a pass, because there are no instructions that actually say anything about the shape or the color of these controls. Now, if I add some instructions here in these examples, so in the first one, the square and the round one, if it said somewhere in the form or in the page, to proceed, press the round button, that is a failure of 133, because I am using, in my instructions, sensory characteristics that might not be obvious to a user. Similarly, the two buttons in the second row that are distinguished purely by color now have an instruction there to proceed, press the green button. That, again, is a failure of 133. So not the fact that I'm using the colors, but the fact that my instructions are referring to those particular colors. I'm going to go and grab my bottle of water. Ugh. There we go. So we had a look at some SCs that are often misinterpreted. There are SCs that are often interpreted or misinterpreted as their complete opposite. 141, use of color. Color is not used as the only visual means of conveying information, indicating an action, prompting a response, or distinguishing a visual element. And I've got a lovely example here that many of us have argued back and forth in our days. I don't know if Adrian's anywhere in the room. If you are, knock. No? He had a similar examples. We had a long rant about this together. We have two paragraphs here. Both paragraphs of text contain a link. In the first example, the link is only distinguished by being dark blue against the black text that we have here. There's no underline, there's nothing else. In the second line, in the second paragraph, we have a link, but I've styled it so that it looks completely indistinguishable from regular text. So it's using black text, there's no underline, there's no other visual clue that there is a link to start with. Now, a lot of auditors that I've talked to at one point wanted to fail this sort of thing under 141 use of color. But in a weird way, they wanted to fail it because it wasn't using color. They were saying, well, it's using the same color as the text, so it's not using color, so I want to fail it because this is the closest thing about color that I can find. And I would disagree with that one. In the first case, yes, I'm using blue text for the link. That's clearly color is the differentiator here. But in the second case, where the link is completely visually hidden, I can't really drag out 141 because there is no use of color that I'm doing here to distinguish things, quite the opposite. Now, similarly, in that same example, some people will then start to say, well, maybe we can fail this because they want to fail it, which is the conceit of the talk. Maybe I can fail this under 131, info and relationships. Now, info and relationships says information structure and relationships conveyed through presentation can be programmatically determined or are available in text. Now, again, with that link that looks exactly like normal text, I'm not doing that. I'm not using presentation. So again, some auditors want to fail it for the opposite of what the SC actually says, for not using visual presentation. And the fact is that success criteria are effectively non-commutative. You can't make the opposite argument. If X, then Y, doesn't mean if Y, then X. So if the SC says you can't use color, then you can't kind of fail something for not using color. And similarly with the 131. If the SC says you can't rely on presentation, you can't then fail things for not using presentation. Then there's interesting things once we start doing audits with WCAG. There are success criteria that effectively lead to what I'd like to call cascades of fail, which is usually a description of my Friday nights. So, cascade of fail, as an example, it will be, I've got a little bit of code here, I've got a link, and that wraps around an image, and the image has no alt text, and there's nothing else in there. It's basically just a link and an unlabeled image. Now, this sort of thing fails a variety of success criteria. So starting right, from the inner element, the image itself fails 111, non-text content, because it's an image and there's no alt text as such. As a result, because the image is the content of the link itself lacks an accessible name and fails 412 name role value. And then arguably, you can also say this link then also fails 244 link purpose, because there is no content in the link. It can't, by definition, convey what its actual purpose is. But the problem with these sorts of cascades of fail often is that as an auditor, you need to decide, am I going to fail all of these, or am I only going to fail like the most important one and leave the other ones that are the consequences of that original fail, which in this case is the fact the image doesn't have an alt. Do I just fail it under 111 in this case and leave the others, as an exercise for the reader when they get their assessment? Or, do I really want to fail this at every single step as it falls down the fail staircase, so to speak? So that's a discussion you need to have internally. Say if you're working in a company that does assessments, there needs to be some kind of company line about this is how we're going to deal with these sorts of things. I'm not saying one approach is necessarily the correct one. Well, obviously mine is, but or not. But you need to have consistency. That goes back to the idea of you need to have two auditors doing the same audit, and they should come roughly to the same conclusion. There are also fun things like interrelated criteria. A classic one, again, 311, language of page. The default human language of each web page can be programmatically determined. And then there's 312, language of parts. The human language of each passage or phrase in the content can be programmatically determined. Now, generally, if your content fails 311, language of page, you've not defined what the language of the page overall is, it's very likely that you're also automatically, effectively, failing 312, because if the browser or the assistive tech doesn't know what's the overall language of this, then it's very likely that it won't be able to determine for each passage or phrase within the page what the language is, unless you went through separately and put lang attributes on every single element. And even if you did that, the title element in the head of the document wouldn't have that. So there would still be pieces of content there that simply haven't got a name. So again, in terms of consistency, knowing that, well, if I fail 311, I can effectively fail 312 right away. And again, that's a case of some auditors will just fail it under 311. Others will fail both pretty much in tandem. As soon as the first one fails, the second one fails automatically. And then we get into the fun kind of AA or AA, AAA kind of pairings of success criteria, where effectively the minimum and enhanced, and the enhanced version is effectively a more stringent version or a stricter version of the minimum success criterion. As an example, 143 contrast minimum, and then you have 146 contrast enhanced. 2411 focus not obscured minimum, 2412 focus not obscured enhanced, 258 target size minimum, 255 target size enhanced. Yes, the number is weird on that one. It went backwards. 338 accessible authentication minimum, and 339 accessible authentication enhanced. That was a mouthful. Basically, if you fail any of the minimum versions of these, you pretty much automatically fail the enhanced versions as well, because the enhanced ones are like a superset or a subset, depending which way you look at it, of the same requirements. And again, this is about consistency. And obviously, for the majority of the enhanced ones, they're usually at AAA, so obviously this only really applies if you're also auditing against AAA. But again, it's a consideration to make, and again, for consistency, it's something that you need to be clear about, that if you're failing this, you automatically fail the enhanced one as well. And yes, this is kind of an auditor education and consistency problem, which you can solve with internal training and internal resources and everything else, as long as everybody's clear that's doing the audits, how we deal with these sorts of things. But there are more problematic issues with WCAG SCs. And the fact is that a lot of the WCAG success criteria, even though they try to hide it sometimes, they are very vague, incomplete, woolly, I often say, or otherwise lacking. WCAG 2 isn't perfect. I mean, it was written by well-meaning but fallible humans, for the most part. The fallible bit, not the humans bit. I think, anyway. And there's a lot of subjectivity. WCAG success criteria can be, in many ways, very subjective. And again, there is the idea they try to hide that fact a little bit, but it is the reality. So there's a lot of SCs, even from the very first ones, that really require a level of subjective kind of understanding of, do I pass this or do I fail this? Examples, 111, all non-text content has a text alternative that serves the equivalent purpose. But nobody really tells you what is the equivalent purpose. You can show 2 or 3 accessibility professionals the same image and its alt text, for instance, and they'll have a lengthy argument over whether that's descriptive enough or not. 122, captions are provided, ... But the SC itself doesn't actually say if the captions need to be exact, if they need to identify the speakers. It basically just makes a very broad statement, 122, about there are captions. 131, information, structure, and relationship conveyed through presentation. But where do you draw the line? And we'll get an example in the next slide. And we've already seen 246, headings and labels describe topic or purpose. But what is descriptive enough? Again, as somebody who's doing audits, I need to use my own judgment to basically look at the description or the heading or whatever and think, yes, that is descriptive enough, whatever that measure is. And going back to the 131, info and relationships, one of the classic questions is always, what is a list? I've got a screenshot here, 3 links, home, products, contact, they're all on the same line, divided by slashes. And in the underlying markup, they're literally just 3 links in sequence. Maybe I'm using CSS to kind of create that slash between them. But I basically just mark them up as 3 links, nothing fancy. Now, do you fail this under 131, info and relationships? Because I didn't wrap this in something like a list, like unordered list or even ordered list, depending on how I look at it. And the problem with that is, particularly with lists, that if you look hard enough, it's turtles, or rather lists, all the way down. Anything can be a list. Do you really fail everything that could potentially be a list just because it's not marked up as a list? Arguable. WCAG also has quite a few strange omissions and ambiguities and exemptions that sometimes catch people out as they're trying to evaluate things. 244, link purpose in context. The purpose of each link can be determined from the link text alone or from the link text together with its programmatically determined link context. But it doesn't really define clearly and unambiguously what this programmatically determined link context is. And there's been an ongoing debate, for instance, even within the Accessibility Guidelines Working Group, of things like, well, if there is a preceding heading, does that provide some kind of programmatic context? Because I can unambiguously, from, say, any link, say, find me the nearest ancestor heading. That can be done unambiguously and programmatically. But does that count or not? And the answer is maybe. Even the working group hasn't kind of really decided. There's lots of arguments for and against. And what we often then get in those situations is, well, I think what the founding fathers / mothers of WCAG meant to say, and then there's a whole argument about why I can basically fail this under this particular success criterion. And I've got an animated GIF here from the Big Lebowski. They're at the bowling. Thank you. And he's here in the room. Almost. Start again. We got the dude shaking his head. It's like, that's just your opinion, man. So there's a lot of argumentations that are made about, well, I think what this SC is actually trying to say. And, therein lies, chaos. So, to alleviate the chaos, there are the understanding documents and the techniques that come with WCAG. But a lot of auditors seem to, especially initially, misunderstand what they stand for. There is the difference between normative, so that's actually the SCs themselves, the WCAG spec itself, and then anything else, like the understanding documents, the techniques, they're non-normative. They're only suggestions, or they give hints about how you can interpret things, but they're certainly not normative. You can't certainly fail something because, well, it's not using the technique that is in the WCAG techniques for this SC. They're only, one of many possible ways of fulfilling the requirement of a success criterion. And by their very nature, the understanding documents and particularly the techniques and the examples, they can't provide examples of every possible scenario because that would be impossible. The wild web is much more complex than you can put into, an exhaustive set of techniques. And these are all the authorized ways for you to pass this particular criterion. Because what essentially counts with WCAG is you are somehow satisfying the ask of that particular SC. And it's not necessarily about how you do that. It's the end result that counts. Now, beyond the need for subjective interpretation, WCAG success criteria themselves have, by their very nature, by the very way they've been written, have loopholes. There are gaps in WCAG SCs. Again, it's a secret, but it's the reality. One that I already ranted about last time, 247 focus visible. Any keyboard operable user interface has a mode of operation where the keyboard focus indicator is visible. However, what the SC fails to do is define normatively what visible actually means. So, the fun example, I've got two buttons on the screen. They both say sign in. They apparently look exactly the same. The one on the right is focused, and I've got a little zoomed in kind of enhanced view of the button on the right, and we can see that there's a single pixel that I've changed from white, maybe you can't even see it on the screens, or just barely, from white to very, very light gray. Now, arguably, that single pixel is visible, and normatively, you would probably have to say this is a pass. It's horrendous, it's monstrous, but normatively, purely based on the language of the success criterion, that is a visible focus indicator. Now, people were aware of this particular problem. So with WCAG 2.1, because of the way the later WCAG versions are kind of additive and they don't change things, it was decided not to modify the definition of focus visible, but to create more success criteria, just to try and patch that particular gap. But unfortunately, and a bit of foreshadowing, these additional SCs also really didn't help that much. So one of these new SCs, new for WCAG 2.1 at the time, that was introduced was 1.4.11, non-text contrast. The visual presentation of the following have a contrast ratio of at least 3:1 against adjacent colors. User interface components, visual information required to identify user information components and states. And then there's an extra bit for graphical objects. But the important one here is the user interface components and states. Focus is a state, so this applies in this particular case as well. Great, we can use this to fix that single pixel problem. And we can. I've got exactly the same as before, but now, when it's focused, the single pixel is still there, but at least I made it a bit darker. So that hits the 3:1 contrast ratio. So now I'm all good under WCAG 2.1 with this particular focus indicator. But we'll fix that in WCAG 2.2 was the thinking then at the time. And there were plans to have very specific SCs that deal exactly with this sort of problem. There were going to be 2.4.11 focus appearance minimum at AA and 2.4.12 focus appearance enhanced at AAA. However, fast forward to WCAG 2.2 actually being released, unfortunately those two fell by the wayside, mainly because they proved to be extremely complex to actually write and then to test. Because whenever you're trying to put a very cut and dry test for something that is inherently visual and inherently malleable, you get into problems. So instead, what we got in WCAG 2.2 is 2.4.13 focus appearance, which does define things. It does explain, the focus indicator should be at least this thick, or it should have this particular color contrast. This area altogether needs to be, this amount and everything else, which is great. The only problem is that it's at level AAA, and AAA is where success criteria go to die for the majority of cases, because, in general, in the wild, if you're doing assessments for companies, it's very rare that they want to go beyond AA. So, if you're doing AAA, yes, you are covered. But if you're only doing assessments up to AA, you still have that single pixel, yes, it's contrasty enough kind of problem. And you have to basically suck it up. I mean, that's the problem with the WCAG SCs and not interpreting them beyond what they actually say. Now, 2.4.11, focus not obscured minimum. This is a new one in WCAG 2.2, since we're talking about focus. That's a new SC that just came out. When a user interface component receives keyboard focus, the component is not entirely hidden due to author-created content. There's also a AAA version of this, again, where SCs go to die, that basically says no part of it is hidden. But, for the most part, we'll be dealing with this, so the focus indicator is not entirely hidden. And the idea is something classic like this. You've got a sticky header, at the top, and as you're scrolling, it can happen that if you're then using the keyboard to navigate, it can happen that links that you then focus on kind of fall behind, are obscured by this sticky header that you've got in your page. And you want to make sure for 2.4.11 at the AA level for focus not obscured, you want to make sure that at least some of it is still visible. That basically your focus doesn't completely disappear behind that sticky header. But again, what does entirely hidden actually mean? And here I've got, again, an extreme example. I've got the same sticky header, and I can just barely see a single pixel line of the element that's in focus, and I've got it kind of zoomed in a little bit as well. Again, arguably, that's not entirely hidden. So this situation would probably pass 2.4.11 as well. Now, some people will disagree. There's a bit of discussion about, well, that's the focus indicator, which is not part of the actual user interface component, so that doesn't count, but you can turn that argument around various ways. I mean, it could be an internal border that you're doing, and again, then you end up with 2 pixels showing. 1.4.1, we already talked about this. Use of color. Color is not used as the only visual means of conveying information, indicating an action, prompting a response, or distinguishing a visual element. Now I've got, again, a sign-in button, and actually on these monitors with their calibration, it's not showing up at all. So I've got a sign-in button that if you use the keyboard and tab onto it, on the right-hand side, it's very faintly greenish, whereas when it's not focused, it's just gray. Now in this situation, you could say 1.4.1 use of color applies. I'm using color. As an author, I'm relying on me being able to perceive the color, or the user being able to perceive the color, to know that that thing is in focus. And I can use the contrast ratio as well, just to make a clear determination. There will be situations where something changes color, but the change is so strong that it is obvious. And then it doesn't count purely as a change of color, because you've also made a change of effectively luminosity or brightness of that. And there's a whole paragraph there that since the last time I did this talk, I actually managed to push that inside the understanding document for 1.4.1. And if you're really bored, there's a link. You can actually follow the discussion that led to that. But now I've got the same sign-in button, and regardless of what I'm doing for focus, if I'm moving my mouse over this, it also changes to a really, really faint kind of green background. But now, would I fail this under 1.4.1 as well? I mean, is the fact that on hover, it just subtly glows a slightly different color, is that really conveying information? Is it important information, or is it just eye candy? So there is certainly a cutoff point somewhere where you could argue, well, you could argue either way. I would argue that's only a visual little hint. The fact that, say, my mouse pointer might change to the hand rather than the pointer, that would be another thing that's already indicating things. There are discussions to be had about these, and that's the whole problem. These SCs are a little bit woolly. So I've got Morpheus here in the dojo doing the come at me sign. Some rules can be bent, others can be broken. It's sometimes difficult to work out exactly where the line is. You get SCs that are overly specific, and by that nature, don't actually end up applying except in very specific cases. 1.4.10 reflow, it's a classic one. Content can be presented without loss of information or functionality and without requiring scrolling in 2 dimensions 4, and it then basically says width 320 CSS pixels or height 256 pixels. Now the way this SC has been written, and I'll see I've got 13 seconds left, so indulge me for a few more minutes after my counter runs out. We can see that the way it's written, it only applies at those particular sizes. So only if my window is at 320 or at 256 CSS pixel height. It doesn't apply in any other scenario. The numbers came from an imagined user that has their display to 1280 by 1024, and they zoom in 400%. But even that display size nowadays is not really that common anymore. And the clock went to 35 minutes, so I don't know. It's a subtle signal. I hope not. Similarly, 1.4.12 text spacing. It goes through in content implemented using markup languages that support the following text style properties. No loss of content or functionality occurs by setting all of the following. And then it goes on to list line height at least 1.5 times the font size, spacing following paragraphs to at least 2 times the font size, letter spacing tracking to at least 0.12 times, word spacing to at least 0.16 times. So very specific numbers there. But it only says at those exact values or over. How do you test the at least part, which is part of the wording? Do you set it to that, and then you start testing further up or not? That's not really defined in the SC. And also, what happens if a user changes only some of these, because it says all of the following? What happens if they only change some of these and your content starts breaking? Is that a failure? That's gray area. That's not really defined. And a classic one for this one, there is one of the few ways to test this is there are bookmarklets out there that you run on your web page, and they set those particular sizes. Now, what happens if the page doesn't change when you run this bookmarklet? Who knows? Normatively, it doesn't say anything about you must be able to change these. It only says if you change these and successfully they get changed, your content doesn't break. So there are ambiguities in how people understand these. Quick one, and then I'll jump a few slides to the conclusion. A new one, 338, accessible authentication minimum, new in WCAG 2.2. A cognitive function test, such as remembering a password or solving a puzzle, is not required for any step in an authentication process. Now, what is an authentication process? Is it, according to the understanding document, it's when you log back into an account that you already created. So we got an interesting situation where on the left, I've got the same form here effectively. On the left, I've got username, password, and then a captcha that asks me to enter what I see. This assumes that I've already got an account. This would fail, or this would fall under the purview of this success criterion. On the right-hand side, I've got the same thing to set up an account. So I've got username, password, re-enter password, and then the same captcha, but in this case, that's not an authentication process as such. It's an account creation process. So in that case, according to the understanding document, this doesn't apply. And then we got SCs that are confusingly titled. I'm just going to jump over these really quickly. Target size minimum, it looks like it's defining a minimum target size. However, it immediately gives an exception for things where it says undersized targets is fine, that they're smaller as long as they have enough spacing around them. So the dirty secret of that SC is you could have a 1x1 pixel link or whatever it is button. As long as you give it enough spacing around it of 24 pixels, that is perfectly fine. Consistent help sounds like, yes, you want consistent help across all your pages. What it actually says is, if a web page contains any of the following help mechanisms, and it goes at length into defining these, across multiple web pages, within a set of web pages, they occur in the same relative order, or same order relative to other page content. So this doesn't mean your pages must have help. That's one of the misunderstandings that was bubbling up early on. And it doesn't really say anything about the visual position of these things, because it talks about the relative order effectively in the source, so your focus order or reading order. So I've got an example here, the same page, it's kind of a faintly disguised W3C homepage, and I've just slapped a support button in there at various points. One is bottom right, and then on another page it could be top left or whatever. That is perfectly fine. It's consistent, as long as it's consistent in the focus order, whether it's visually in different places, that is fine under that success criterion. So, are you not entertained? I've got Russell Crowe here in Gladiator. So even after years of auditing, this kind of inconsistency, these problems kind of catch me out, even me, since I live and breathe some of these WCAG things. And I get these sudden clarity Clarence moments. So I've got a picture here of somebody in a club looking like they've just had a massive revelation while everybody's dancing. WCAG is all subjective. But the same discussion that we're having here and that we're seeing here also happen even within the accessibility guidelines working group themselves. So don't think of people working here on the standards that they have all the answers. We all don't know what we're doing. That's the secret. And the problem is WCAG needs to be testable. It doesn't allow for nuance. WCAG SCs are binary. You either pass or fail. They don't allow for saying, well, you fail it a little bit or you pass it just. And often, things that the SCs say are just a line in the sand. I've got a contrast requirement, color contrast analyzer showing two pairs of colors that are virtually indistinguishable. One just happens to hit the 4.5 to 1 mark. The other one is just below. It doesn't mean that all of a sudden something becomes completely inaccessible when it crosses that threshold. It's a line in the sand. There's no weight given to impact or frequency of how bad something is off. You either pass or you fail, basically. Fail a single SC and you can't really claim conformance. And all these loopholes and omissions and everything else can be and will be exploited as well. So it's not only auditors that try to fudge things and say this fails the SC. There will be authors out there that also try to use these loopholes to justify why they're doing things that aren't really all that kosher. Because in the end, a lot of the developers want this. They want the Bobby-approved image there on their website. So what do we do then? I've got an animated GIF of Waldorf and Statler, and I've been taken off. Thank you.